The sun was barely up when Rebecca Mackenzie finished packing the last of her belongings into the wooden crate. Her hands shook slightly as she folded her mother's blue dress, the one with tiny flowers that smelled like home even after all these months. Missouri felt like a lifetime ago now, but the memories still hit her hard sometimes. "You ready for this, little sister?" her brother Daniel asked from the doorway. His wife Catherine stood beside him, one hand resting on her growing belly. They'd been planning this journey west for over a year, ever since the fever took their parents. Daniel said California held promise for all of them. A fresh start. A new life where the past couldn't follow. Rebecca nodded, though her stomach twisted with nerves. At 22, she'd never been more than 50 miles from the farm where she grew up. Now they were about to travel over 1,000 miles through unknown territory. She'd heard the stories about what happened to wagon trains that didn't make it. The attacks. The starvation. The diseases that swept through camps like wildfire, but staying meant teaching school in a town that reminded her of everything she'd lost. Every corner held a memory of her father's medical practice or her mother's garden. Daniel was right. They needed this chance. The wagon train gathered at dawn outside Independence, Missouri. 43 families, all heading west with dreams bigger than their fears. Rebecca watched as children ran between the wagons, excited about the adventure ahead. Their parents looked more worried, checking supplies one last time and whispering about the dangers that lay ahead. The wagon master was a gruff man, named Jeremiah Hartwell. He'd made this journey 6 times before, and his weathered face showed every mile. During the first meeting, he laid out the rules in a voice that carried across the entire camp. "We leave at sunrise, no exceptions. Anyone not ready gets left behind. We stop when I say stop, we move when I say move. You follow my orders, and most of you will make it to California. You don't, and you'll be buzzard food before we reach the mountains." Rebecca felt Catherine grab her arm. Daniel's face had gone pale, but he nodded along with the other men. This was their reality now. The first week felt like an adventure. The weather stayed clear, and the trail was well marked. Rebecca walked alongside their wagon during the day, enjoying the endless sky and rolling grasslands. She'd brought several books with her, and in the evenings, she read to the children while their mothers prepared dinner. She quickly became popular among the families. Her father had taught her basic medical care before he died, and she knew how to read and write better than most people in the group. When little Timothy Johnson came down with a fever, his mother brought him to Rebecca first, not the traveling doctor who spent most days drunk. "You have healing hands," Mrs. Johnson said after Rebecca's cool compresses broke the boy's fever. "Just like a real doctor." Rebecca blushed at the praise, but it felt good to be useful. She'd always wanted to help people, and out here, her skills mattered in ways they never had back home. As the days turned into weeks, the journey grew harder. The easy trails gave way to rough terrain that jolted the wagons and wore down both people and animals. Water became precious. Food supplies that seemed generous at the start began to look smaller with each passing day. The first real trouble came during the 3rd week. The Johnson family's wagon broke an axle crossing a rocky stream. While the men worked to repair it, precious hours slipped away. Hartwell paced like a caged animal, constantly checking the sky and muttering about schedules. "We can't afford delays," he announced that evening. "Winter comes early in the mountains. Every day we lose here could mean death up there." Rebecca noticed how the atmosphere changed after that. Families started watching each other more carefully. Who was eating too much? Who wasn't pulling their weight? The children sensed the tension and played more quietly. Daniel tried to keep spirits up in their small group. He'd always been the optimist in the family, the one who saw opportunity where others saw problems. But even he started to worry when their oxen began showing signs of exhaustion. "Maybe we should have stayed," Catherine whispered one night as they lay under the stars. Her pregnancy was starting to show more, and the constant jolting of the wagon left her sick most mornings. "We'll make it," Daniel assured her. Rebecca's grandmother crossed this same trail 30 years ago. "If an old woman could do it, then we can do it now." Rebecca wasn't so sure. Each day brought new challenges, broken wheels, Sick animals, contaminated water that left half the camp with stomach problems. She found herself treating more patients each evening, using up her limited supply of medicines and relying more on prayer than science. The worst part was watching the faces around the evening fires. The excitement of the early days had faded into grim determination. People spoke less and ate less. Children stopped playing games and started clinging to their parents. During the 6th week, they reached what Hartwell called the point of no return. Behind them lay 1,000 miles of difficult but familiar territory. Ahead stretched the real wilderness, desert, mountains, territory where few white people had ever set foot. "Anyone who wants to turn back, now's your chance," Hartwell announced. "From here on, the only way out is through?" Not a single family chose to leave. They'd all invested too much to give up now. Rebecca looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight and saw her own determination reflected back. They were committed now, for better or worse. The desert hit them like a furnace. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and the nights brought cold that cut through their blankets. Water became more precious than gold. Rebecca watched. Families rationed their supplies with the desperation of people who knew their lives depended on every drop. She learned to find moisture in places she'd never imagined. Dew collected on canvas, water trapped in cactus plants, morning condensation on metal tools. Her father's medical training had taught her about the human body's need for water, and she shared that knowledge freely, helping families stretch their supplies. But knowledge couldn't create water where none existed. As they moved deeper into the desert, Rebecca began to see the signs of real trouble. Animals dying, people collapsing, families arguing over resources that grew scarcer each day. The evening fires grew smaller. Food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Children cried from hunger, and parents went without meals to feed their young ones. Rebecca gave away most of her own food, surviving on whatever scraps others could spare. Hartwell's leadership became more desperate and harsh. He drove them harder each day, pushing for longer hours and shorter rest stops. When families complained, he reminded them that winter in the mountains would kill them all if they didn't maintain their schedule. "He's right," Daniel told Rebecca one evening as they prepared for another restless night. "We can't afford to slow down now." Rebecca nodded, but she wondered how many of them would survive to see those mountains. The desert was testing them in ways they'd never imagined, and she feared the worst was still ahead. Each morning she woke hoping to see the end of the endless sand and rock. Each evening she went to sleep knowing they faced another day of the same deadly routine. The only thing that kept her going was the knowledge that turning back meant certain death. They'd burned their bridges when they left Missouri. Now their only choice was to keep moving forward, no matter what waited ahead. 3 months into their journey, the wagon train had become a moving graveyard of broken dreams. Rebecca counted 27 graves they'd left behind since Missouri. Cholera had taken the Miller family's youngest daughter, a snakebite claimed. Old Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Wright, died giving birth to a baby who lived only 3 days. The desert had finally given way to rocky hills and scattered pine trees, but the relief felt hollow. Everyone was too tired, too hungry, and too scared to celebrate. Rebecca looked at her reflection in a piece of broken mirror and barely recognized herself. Her face had grown thin and weathered. Her hands were cracked and scarred from months of hard work. Daniel tried to stay positive, but even he struggled now. Their oxen were barely alive, stumbling forward on pure instinct. Catherine's pregnancy had become difficult. She could hardly keep food down, and the constant jolting of the wagon left her weak and pale. "Maybe we should rest here for a few days," Daniel suggested one morning as they prepared to move again. Hartwell's response was swift and harsh. "Rest means death. Winter's coming, and we're already behind schedule. Anyone who can't keep up gets left behind." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd heard rumors about wagon trains making that terrible choice before, families abandoning their weakest members to save the rest. She'd always thought such stories were exaggerated. Now she wasn't so sure. The attack came on a Tuesday morning just after sunrise. Rebecca was walking beside their wagon, helping Catherine, who felt too sick to ride. the day seemed peaceful enough. Birds sang in the pine trees, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of mountain flowers. Then the world exploded into chaos. The first arrow struck their lead ox in the neck. The animal screamed and collapsed, pulling the wagon sideways and trapping Catherine underneath the wooden seat. Rebecca heard Daniel shout her name, but his voice was lost in the sudden storm of war cries and gunshots. Apache warriors appeared from behind, rocks and trees like ghosts materializing from thin air. They moved with deadly precision, targeting the oxen first to stop the wagons from escaping. Rebecca counted at least 20 riders, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. She dove under the wagon as arrows whistled overhead. Catherine was unconscious, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead where she'd hit the wooden seat. Rebecca tried to pull her sister-in-law to safety, but the woman was too heavy and Rebecca's hands were shaking too badly to get a good grip. The battle lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Rebecca watched in horror as families she'd grown to love were scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Mrs. Johnson ran screaming across the camp, carrying little Timothy in her arms. She made it maybe 50 yards before an arrow brought her down. When the shooting finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over what remained of their wagon train. Rebecca stayed hidden under the wagon, holding her breath and listening to her heart pound. She could hear moaning from the wounded and the sound of horses moving through the camp. After what felt like forever, the Apache riders disappeared as quickly as they'd come. They took some supplies and a few horses, but Rebecca realized this hadn't been about stealing. This had been about sending a message, about protecting their territory from invaders who didn't belong. She crawled out from under the wagon and looked around at the devastation. Half the wagons were destroyed or overturned. Bodies lay scattered across the camp. Blood stained the ground that had been their temporary home just minutes before. "Rebecca!" Daniel's voice called from somewhere in the chaos. She found him kneeling beside their overturned wagon, trying to lift it off Catherine. His left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly broken, but he kept pulling at the heavy wood with his right hand. Together, they managed to free Catherine. She was alive but unconscious, with a deep gash on her leg and bruises covering her arms. Rebecca used strips torn from her dress to bandage the worst wounds, drawing on everything her father had taught her about treating injuries. The survivors gathered in the center of camp as the sun climbed higher. Hartwell was alive but badly shaken. An arrow had grazed his shoulder, and his usual commanding presence had crumbled into something that looked more like panic. Rebecca counted the faces around the circle. 18 people out of the original 43 families. 18 people staring at each other with the hollow eyes of those who'd seen too much death. "We need to bury the dead and move on," Hartwell announced, his voice shaky but trying to sound authoritative. "The Apache might come back." "Some of us can't move," Daniel said, cradling his broken arm. "Catherine needs time to heal. Rebecca's got medical training. She can help the wounded." Hartwell's face hardened. "We don't have time for the wounded. Winter's coming and we're already weeks behind schedule. Anyone who can't travel gets left behind." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She looked around the circle and saw the terrible truth in people's faces. Fear had replaced compassion. Survival had become more important than loyalty. "You can't be serious," she said, standing up despite her shaking legs. "These people risked everything to make this journey with us. We're family now." "Family doesn't mean anything if we're all dead," replied Mrs. Patterson, one of the few women who'd survived. "My children need to reach California. I won't sacrifice them for people who might not make it anyway." The debate went on for hours, but Rebecca could see how it would end. Fear made people cruel. Desperation made them selfish. One by one, the survivors chose to save themselves rather than risk helping others. By evening, the decision was final. The wagon train would continue with whoever could travel immediately. The wounded would be left behind with what supplies could be spared. Daniel fought the decision until the very end. He begged, argued, and even threatened to leave the group, himself to stay with his family. But with a broken arm and a pregnant wife who couldn't travel, he knew they wouldn't survive alone in the wilderness. I'll come back for you, he promised Rebecca as the survivors prepared to leave the next morning. Once we reach California, I'll send help, I swear it. Rebecca nodded and tried to smile, but they both knew the truth. No one would be coming back. The wilderness didn't give second chances. She watched the wagons disappear over the ridge, carrying away everyone she'd grown to care about over the past 3 months. Daniel looked back once, his face twisted with grief and guilt, before Catherine pulled him forward. Then Rebecca was alone with 2 other wounded travelers. Old Mr. Cooper, who'd taken an arrow to the chest and couldn't stop coughing up blood, and young Billy Martinez, barely 16 years old, with a leg wound that had turned green with infection. The silence after the wagons left was deafening. No voices, no creaking wheels, no sounds of civilization at all. Just wind through the pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Rebecca looked at their meager supplies. 3 days of water, maybe 4 if they were careful, a handful of dried meat, some flour that had spilled from a torn sack. Not enough to keep 3 people alive for long. Cooper died on the 2nd day. Billy lasted until the 4th morning, delirious with fever and calling for his mother in Spanish. Rebecca buried them both using a broken wagon wheel as a shovel, saying prayers her father had taught her, and promising their spirits that someone would remember their names. Then she was truly alone. One woman in an endless wilderness with no food, no water, and no hope of rescue. The desert sun beat down mercilessly during the day. The mountain cold cut through her thin dress at night. Every step was agony. Every breath was a struggle, but something deep inside refused to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness inherited from her father. Maybe it was the knowledge that dying here would mean the Apache attack had accomplished exactly what it intended. Or maybe it was simply the human refusal to surrender to the inevitable. Whatever it was, Rebecca kept walking. 1 step at a time, 1 breath at a time, waiting for either rescue or death, whichever found her first. 6 days alone in the wilderness had pushed Rebecca beyond what she thought possible. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Her feet, wrapped in torn pieces of her dress, left bloody prints on the rocky ground. The arrow wound in her shoulder had stopped bleeding but burned like fire with every movement. She'd learned to move like a ghost through the landscape, hiding from shadows that might be riders and jumping at sounds that turned out to be wind through the rocks. Water had become her obsession. She'd found a few drops of dew on leaves at dawn, a tiny puddle in a rock depression after a brief shower. Each precious sip kept her alive for another few hours. On the morning of the 6th day, Rebecca found herself staring at a small rabbit caught in a makeshift trap she'd barely remembered setting the night before. The animal was injured, probably from trying to escape, and looked up at her with dark eyes that seemed almost human. Her hands shook as she reached for the rabbit. Food, real food. Her stomach cramped with hunger so intense it made her dizzy. This little creature could mean the difference between life and death, but as she looked into those frightened eyes, something inside her broke. She thought about all the death she'd witnessed, all the cruelty, all the times people had chosen survival over compassion. Here was her chance to be different. Rebecca used the last drops from her water bottle to clean the rabbit's injured leg, then carefully released it from the trap. The animal limped away into the brush, stopping once to look back at her before disappearing. Stupid, she whispered to herself. That was really stupid. But somehow, she felt better than she had in days. The sun climbed higher, beating down on her with merciless intensity. Rebecca's vision started to blur. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She stumbled over rocks she should have seen and walked into branches that scraped her already torn dress. By midday, she couldn't go any further. She collapsed in the shade of a large boulder, too weak to care about snakes or other dangers that might be hiding nearby. This was it. She'd fought as hard as she could, but the desert was going to win. She closed her eyes and thought about her parents, about Daniel and Catherine, about all the families from the wagon train who trusted her to read to their children and tend their sick. Maybe dying wasn't the worst thing that could happen. Maybe it was just another kind of journey, the Sound of a horse snorting nearby snapped her back to consciousness. Rebecca's eyes flew open, her heart pounding with terror. Through the heat shimmer, she saw a rider sitting motionless about 50 yards away, watching her. He was Apache. She could tell from his long black hair and the way he sat his horse like they were one creature. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows. The same kind of arrows that had killed her friends and destroyed her wagon train. Rebecca tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. She managed to push herself up against the boulder, trying to face death with some dignity. If this was how her story ended, she wouldn't go out begging. The rider dismounted and walked toward her slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Rebecca got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 20s, with intelligent dark eyes and features that spoke of strength without cruelty. He stopped a few feet away and studied her for a long moment. Rebecca waited for the arrow or knife that would end her suffering. Instead, he said something in Apache that sounded almost like a question. When she didn't respond, he switched to broken English. "You alone?" Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice. "Where others?" "Gone," she managed to croak. "Left me." The Apache man's eyebrows rose slightly. He said something else in his own language that sounded surprised. Then he walked in a slow circle around her, looking at the rocky ground. Rebecca realized he was reading the signs of her journey, the blood drops, the unsteady footprints, the places where she'd fallen and struggled back to her feet. He found the rabbit trap nearby and examined it carefully. Then he followed the small animal's tracks to where she'd released it. When he came back, his expression had changed completely. "Why?" he asked, pointing to where the rabbit had gone. Rebecca wasn't sure how to explain something she barely understood herself. "It was hurt like me." The Apache man stared at her for a long time. Then he did something that shocked her completely. He knelt down and offered her his water skin. Rebecca grabbed it with shaking hands and took a small sip, knowing that drinking too much too fast could make her sick. The water was warm but tasted better than anything she'd ever experienced. She forced herself to stop after a few swallows and tried to hand it back. The Apache man shook his head and gestured for her to keep it. Then he stood and looked around the area, seeming to make some kind of decision. He said something in Apache that sounded like a name, then pointed to himself. It took Rebecca a moment to realize he was introducing himself. The sounds were difficult for her English-speaking tongue, but it seemed to start with Kai and end with something that sounded like wind. Kai ... She tried, and he nodded. "Encourgingly. Then?" He pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. "Rebecca," she whispered. He tried to repeat it, but struggled with the sounds the same way she had with his name. Finally, he settled on something that sounded like Rebecca. Spoken with careful precision, Kai looked at the sun, then at her weakened condition. He said something in Apache that sounded urgent, then gestured toward his horse. Rebecca realized he was offering to take her somewhere. Every story she'd ever heard about Apache captives flooded her mind. Women stolen from their families, children raised as warriors, torture and slavery and worse. But looking into Kai's eyes, she didn't see cruelty. She saw something that looked almost like compassion. Besides, what choice did she have? Stay here and die slowly, or trust this stranger who'd given her water when he could have just taken her scalp and moved on. Kai seemed to understand her hesitation. He pointed to her shoulder wound, which had started bleeding again during her collapse. Then he made gestures that clearly meant help and safe. His voice was gentle when he spoke. Even though she couldn't understand the words, he helped her stand, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out again. His touch was careful, respectful, not what she would have expected from a warrior. Getting onto the horse was agony, but Kai was patient. He adjusted her position so she wouldn't fall, then mounted behind her. Rebecca found herself pressed against his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat and the warmth of his body. As they rode deeper into the mountains, Rebecca's fevered mind tried to make sense of what was happening. Why would an Apache warrior save the life of a white woman? Why show kindness to someone from the same group that had invaded his territory? She thought about the rabbit again, about the moment when she'd chosen compassion over survival. Maybe Kai had seen something in that action that spoke to him. Maybe kindness was a language that didn't need words. The horse's steady rhythm and Kai's gentle handling gradually relaxed her. For the first time in days, Rebecca felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope, not just for survival, but for something she couldn't yet name. The sun was setting when they finally stopped. Kai had brought her to a hidden canyon that seemed to exist in a different world from the harsh desert she'd been wandering. Green grass grew near a small stream. Trees provided shade and shelter. The air itself felt cooler and more peaceful. Other Apache were waiting for them. Rebecca tensed, expecting hostility or worse. Instead, she saw curiosity and concern. An elderly woman approached with what was clearly medical supplies. A young man brought fresh water and food. Kai spoke to them in rapid Apache, gesturing toward Rebecca and then toward the direction they'd come from. She caught the word for rabbit and saw several people nod with what looked like approval. As the elderly woman began tending to her wounds with gentle, skilled hands, Rebecca realized something incredible was happening. She wasn't being treated as a captive or prisoner. She was being welcomed as someone deserving of care and respect. Kai sat nearby, watching over her treatment with protective attention. When their eyes met, he said something in Apache that she didn't understand but somehow felt in her heart. Later, she would learn that he'd told his grandmother she was the woman from the vision, the one the spirits had promised would come to teach them about building bridges between worlds. For now, though, Rebecca simply closed her eyes and let herself believe in the impossible idea that she might actually survive this ordeal, that kindness might be stronger than hate, that sometimes the people you least expect turn out to be exactly who you need. Recovery came slowly for Rebecca, like sunrise creeping over the canyon walls. The first week passed in a haze of fever and pain as her body fought the infection from her arrow wound. Kai's grandmother, who everyone called Nayeli, worked tirelessly to save her life using medicines Rebecca had never seen before. The old woman made pastes from desert plants that drew poison from wounds. She brewed teas from roots that brought down fever. Her weathered hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd been healing people for decades. When Rebecca finally opened her eyes without burning fever clouding her vision, Nayeli smiled and said something in Apache that needed no translation. "She says you have a fighter's spirit," Kai explained in his careful English. "Like the mountain cat that refuses to surrender even when trapped." Rebecca tried to sit up but found her muscles still too weak. "How long was I sick?" 7 days. We thought, Kai paused, searching for the right words. "We thought the spirits might call you home." Looking around the small shelter where she'd been recovering, Rebecca saw evidence of the care she'd received. Someone had washed and mended her torn dress. A beautiful woven blanket covered her, soft and warm despite being made from materials she didn't recognize. Fresh water sat within easy reach along with a bowl of something that smelled like soup. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why did you save me?" "Your people and mine are at war." Kai was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the canyon beyond the shelter entrance. "Not all Apache want war. My uncle, our war chief, believes fighting is the only way to protect our land. But some of us think there might be another path." He turned to look at her directly. "When I saw you release that rabbit, I knew the spirits had sent you for a reason. No one starving to death gives away food unless their heart is bigger than their fear." Over the following weeks, as Rebecca's strength slowly returned, she began to understand the unique situation she'd found herself in. Kai's band consisted of about 30 Apache who had chosen to separate themselves from the main tribe. They weren't warriors in the traditional sense, but families who wanted to find a way to coexist with the changing world around them. The white settlers keep coming, explained Kai's cousin, a man named Dakota who spoke better English than most. "We can fight them forever and lose our children to war, or we can try to learn from each other." The idea seemed impossible to Rebecca at first. The attack on her wagon train was still fresh in her memory. But as days passed and she observed Life in the canyon, she began to see these people differently than the stories had taught her. Children played games that looked familiar despite the different language. Mothers worried about their babies the same way Catherine had worried about her unborn child. Fathers taught their sons to hunt and their daughters to gather medicine plants. The daily rhythms of life weren't so different from what she'd known back in Missouri. Rebecca started helping around the camp as soon as she could walk without dizziness. At first, people were uncertain about having a white woman involved in their daily activities. But her willingness to work and learn gradually won them over. She helped the women gather roots and berries, learning which plants were safe to eat and which had medicinal properties. She discovered that Apache mothers dealt with the same childhood illnesses she'd treated back home, and her knowledge of fever reduction and wound care proved valuable. Most surprisingly, she found herself teaching. It started when she showed a young boy named Ahiga how to write his name in English letters on a piece of bark. Soon, a small group of children gathered around her each evening, fascinated by the strange symbols that could carry meaning. Kai watched these lessons with intense interest. "Show me," he said one evening after the children had gone to sleep. Rebecca found a smooth patch of sand and began drawing letters with a stick. She started with simple words that connected to things around them. Tree, water, horse, sky. Kai practiced writing each word over and over until he could form the letters without help. "Why is this important?" he asked as they worked by firelight. "Because the white world runs on written words," Rebecca explained. "Treaties, laws, trade agreements. If your people want to negotiate with settlers, you need to understand how their language works on paper, not just when spoken." Kai nodded thoughtfully. "And you could teach this to others?" "Yes, but—" Rebecca hesitated. "I would need to learn your language too." Real communication goes both ways. That's how Rebecca found herself becoming a student as well as a teacher. Nayeli took charge of her Apache lessons, starting with basic words for daily activities and gradually building up to more complex ideas. Learning Apache proved much harder than teaching English. The sounds were different, and the grammar worked in ways that confused her English-speaking mind. But Rebecca persisted, driven by a growing desire to truly understand these people who had saved her life. As autumn settled over the canyon, Rebecca realized her feelings toward Kai had grown into something she hadn't expected. It wasn't just gratitude for saving her, though that was certainly part of it. She found herself looking forward to their evening language lessons and the conversations that followed. Kai had a way of thinking about problems that was completely different from any man she'd known. He saw connections between things that seemed unrelated. He understood that sometimes the strongest response to aggression was unexpected kindness. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. One evening, as they sat by the stream that ran through the canyon, Kai asked her something that had clearly been on his mind for a while. "When you are strong enough to travel, will you try to find your brother?" Rebecca had been dreading this question. Her physical health had mostly returned, but the thought of leaving the canyon filled her with unexpected sadness. "I don't know," she admitted. "Daniel probably thinks I'm dead by now. And even if I found him, how could I explain what happened? Here? How could I make him understand that the Apache who saved my life aren't the same ones who attacked our wagon train?" "You could be a bridge," Kai said quietly. "Someone who speaks both languages and understands both worlds. Is that what you want? For me to be a bridge?" Kai looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I want you to choose your own path. But yes, I think you could help our peoples understand each other. If you wanted to—" The possibility both excited and terrified Rebecca. Stay here, and she'd be giving up any chance of reuniting with Daniel and Catherine. But leave, and she'd be walking away from people who had become family and a man who had become something even more important. "There's something else," Kai continued. "My uncle, the war chief, doesn't know you're here. We've kept your presence secret because we knew he would see you as a prize of war. But winter is coming, and it's getting harder to hide the fact that we're sheltering a white woman." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What happens when he finds out?" "I don't know. But we need to decide what we're going to do before he decides for us." That night, Rebecca lay awake staring at the stars visible through the shelter's smoke hole. For months, her only goal had been survival. Now she faced a choice that would determine not just her future, but possibly the futures of everyone in this canyon. She thought about Daniel and Catherine, who were probably safe in California by now, building the new life they'd dreamed about. She thought about her students back in Missouri, learning to read from books that told them nothing about the real world beyond their small town. Then she thought about little Ahiga, so excited to learn that letters could carry meaning. About Naeli, who had saved her life with knowledge passed down through generations. About Kai, who saw possibilities where others saw only conflict. By morning, Rebecca knew what her choice would be. She just hoped she'd have the courage to follow through with it when the time came. The choice was made for Rebecca on a cold November morning when the sound of horses echoed through the canyon. She was teaching her usual group of children when Kai came running, his face tight with worry. "Soldiers," he said quietly, so as not to frighten the young ones. "A full patrol, maybe 20 men. And someone's with them who knows these mountains." Rebecca's heart stopped. She'd always known this day might come, but she'd allowed herself to hope it would be later, after winter, when she'd had more time to figure out her future. "My brother?" she asked. Kai nodded grimly. "The man in front looks like you. Same eyes, same way of sitting a horse." Rebecca stood slowly, her mind racing. Daniel had kept his promise. He'd come back for her just as he'd sworn he would. The brother who'd raised her after their parents died, who'd fought against leaving her behind, who'd probably spent months searching these mountains. But Daniel was also bringing soldiers into a place where Apache families lived. Children played here, elders told stories here. People who had shown her nothing but kindness would now face armed men who saw them only as enemies. "Get everyone to the hidden caves," Rebecca told Kai. "You know, the place up the north trail where the rocks hide the entrance. What about you? I'll go meet them. Maybe I can convince Daniel to turn back without anyone getting hurt." Kai grabbed her arm. "They won't just turn back. They've come too far and worked too hard to find you. And when they see you're alive well, they'll want to know who helped you." Rebecca knew he was right, but she had to try something. "Then I'll tell them I survived on my own, that I found this canyon and lived here alone all these months." "They won't believe that." "They might if I can convince Daniel that it's true." Kai studied her face for a long moment. "There's another choice." "What?" "Come with them. Go back to your old life. Pretend none of this ever happened." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Leave the canyon? Leave the people who had become her family? Leave Kai? "Is that what you want?" she asked. "I want you to be safe. If staying here puts you in danger, then yes, I want you to go." Rebecca looked around the canyon that had become home. Children were already moving toward the caves, their parents gathering essential supplies with the practiced efficiency of people who'd had to hide before. Naeli caught her eye and nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed both understanding and blessing. "No," Rebecca said firmly. "I'm not leaving. But I'm not going to let anyone get hurt because of me either." She kissed Kai quickly before she could lose her nerve, then walked toward the canyon entrance to meet whatever was coming. Daniel saw her first. He was older than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes and gray streaking his brown hair. But when he spotted her walking toward the patrol, his face lit up with such joy that Rebecca felt tears start down her cheeks. "Rebecca!" He jumped down from his horse and ran toward her, sweeping her into a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "Dear God, I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you forever." "I'm all right," she whispered into his shoulder, breathing in the familiar smell of his coat. "I'm all right, Daniel." The soldiers watched this reunion with expressions ranging from relief to suspicion. Their captain, a weathered man with careful eyes, dismounted and approached them. "Miss Mackenzie, I'm Captain Morrison. Your brother has been searching for you for months. We're here to take you home safely." Rebecca looked at the 20 armed men behind him, then back at her brother's hopeful face. "How did you find me?" "Apache tracks led us here," Morrison replied. "This canyon shows signs of recent habitation. We need to know if any hostiles are." in the area. The word hostiles made Rebecca's stomach clench. These soldiers saw Kai's people the same way Hartwell had seen the Apache who'd attacked their wagon train, as enemies to be defeated rather than people trying to protect their families. "There's no one here but me," she said carefully. "I've, been living alone since the attack?" Daniel frowned. "Alone? Rebecca, how did you survive?" "Your injuries, the winter coming, I found plants that were safe to eat, ways to stay warm. I'm stronger than you remember. Morrison wasn't buying it." "Miss, with respect, no white woman survives 4 months alone in Apache territory. Without help, someone's been taking care of you." "I've been taking care of myself." "Then you won't mind if we search the canyon to make sure it's secure." Rebecca felt panic rise in her throat. The hidden caves weren't that well concealed. If the soldiers searched thoroughly, they'd find 30 Apache, including children and elders. People would die, and it would be her fault. "Captain," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I understand your caution, but I give you my word there's no threat here. Can't we just leave peacefully?" Morrison's expression hardened. "I'm not taking the word of someone who's clearly been through trauma." "Men, prepare to search the area?" "No." Rebecca stepped between the soldiers and the canyon. "I won't let you do that." Daniel stared at her in shock. "Rebecca, what's gotten into you? These men are here to help." "Help by threatening innocent people?" "What innocent people? You said you were alone." Rebecca realized her mistake too late. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, seeing through the lies the way only a brother could. "There are Apache here, aren't there?" he said quietly. "The ones who've been helping you." Rebecca nodded slowly. There was no point in lying anymore. "How many?" Morrison demanded, his hand moving to his weapon. 30. "But they're not warriors, they're families. People who saved my life and asked for nothing in return." Apache are Apache," Morrison said grimly. "They're all dangerous." "No, they're not." Rebecca's voice grew stronger. "The man who found me could have killed me or taken me prisoner. Instead, he brought me here and his grandmother healed my wounds. Children here have learned to write their names in English. Women have shared their knowledge of plants that cure sickness." She looked directly at Daniel. "These people are trying to build bridges instead of burning them." "They want peace, not war," Morrison laughed harshly. "And you believe that?" "Miss, Apache have been raiding settlements for years. They're savages who only understand violence. They're not savages." Rebecca's patience finally snapped. "They're people who are trying to protect their families and their way of life. Just like you would if strangers invaded your home." The tension in the canyon was thick enough to cut. Soldiers had their hands on their weapons. Daniel looked torn. Between relief at finding his sister and horror at what she was saying, then Kai appeared. He walked out from behind the rocks with his hands visible and empty, moving slowly so no one would see him as a threat. Behind him came Dakota and 3 other men, also unarmed but ready to defend their families if necessary. "Rebecca," Kai said in English, his voice calm despite the dangerous situation. "Are you safe?" Daniel's eyes went wide as he realized what he was seeing, the gentle way Kai looked at his sister, the protective stance he took beside her, the obvious concern in his voice. "You're in love with him," Daniel said, more statement than question. Rebecca met her brother's gaze steadily. "Yes, and he loves me." Morrison's reaction was swift and predictable. "Miss Mackenzie, you've clearly been brainwashed by these savages. We're taking you home immediately. This is my home now." "Like hell it is," Morrison gestured to his men. "Arrest the hostiles. We'll sort this out back at the fort." "Wait," Rebecca stepped forward. "Captain, what if I could offer you something?" "Better than prisoners?" Morrison paused. "Such as? A translator?" "Someone who speaks both languages and understands both cultures. Someone who could help negotiate real peace instead of just more fighting." She looked around at all the faces watching her. Daniel, confused and hurt. Morrison, suspicious and impatient. Kai, proud and worried. The Apache men, ready to fight? For their families, if necessary? "I've learned something these past months," Rebecca continued. "War happens because people stop seeing each other as human, but I've lived in both worlds now. I know that Apache mothers love their children the same way white mothers do. I know that Apache men want to protect their families just like white men do. She took a deep breath. Let me be a bridge between our peoples. Let me help you understand each other instead of just fighting. Morrison looked skeptical, but Daniel was listening intently. You could work at the fort? Her brother asked slowly. As an interpreter? Yes, and Kai's people could relocate to the protected valley the government promised. A place where children could grow up learning both ways of life. It wasn't a perfect solution. Rebecca knew there would be resistance on both sides. Some Apache would see her as a traitor for working with soldiers. Some whites would never accept her relationship with Kai. But as she looked around the canyon at people she'd come to love, Rebecca knew she'd found her true calling. Not as a school teacher in a small Missouri town, but as someone who could help heal the wounds between two worlds. Morrison agreed to a temporary truce while Rebecca's proposal was considered by his superiors. Daniel struggled with his sister's choices but ultimately supported her right to make them, and that evening, as the sun set over the canyon one last time before they all moved to uncertain futures, Kai took Rebecca's hand in his. Are you sure about this path? He asked softly. Daka looked at the man who had saved her life and taught her that destiny sometimes comes disguised as disaster.